My name is Beth Fortune. I'm Vice Chancellor for Public Affairs at Vanderbilt, and I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion today, Education Equity 50 Years After Coleman. First, I'd like to recognize all of the public officials and the representatives who are here with us today. Those include, I believe, Kathy Buggs from Representative Jim Cooper's office. We have State Representative John Ray Clemens, and we also have Councilmember Berkeley Allen, who happens to represent the Vanderbilt district. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. I'd also like to now acknowledge and welcome Dr. Laura Velashik-Dermody, who is Director of Assessment and Special Projects in the Dean of Students Office at Vanderbilt. James Coleman, one of the authors of the report we will be discussing today, was her uncle and a great influence on her as a person and as a scholar. We are so pleased his passion for education influenced Laura to come to Vanderbilt. Laura? We're on the front. Now, you may have noticed that I mentioned James Coleman as one of the authors of the report. Many people don't realize that he had a co-author, and that was Ernest Campbell. Ernest, who would have been 90 years old this year, was a former chair of the Department of Sociology at Vanderbilt and a dean of the graduate school. He was a tour de force in sociology, particularly as it relates to important social interventions such as desegregation. Because of the body of his work, and I hope you will read more about him in your program, Ernest received a call from the U.S. Department of Education to serve as co-director of the project that would come to be known as the Coleman Report. Had Ernest not been such a gentleman, had he not insisted that the co-authors be listed alphabetically, the project may have come to be known as the Campbell Report. Ernest's history would not be complete without another important piece of this story. That is, during his early teaching career when he took a position at Mississippi Southern University and he met the love of his wife, Burdell Taylor. They were married for 64 years before his death in 2013. Burdell is a force of nature herself. She was honored just last week with the SAGE Award from the Council on Aging. She is with us today, and I'd like to recognize her. Burdell, will you stand? Thank you for being here, Burdell. It's such an honor. Now, just a few housekeeping items. If you would like to submit a question for the panel, there are 3x5 index cards available at the registration desk. Please give those to Jennifer Johnson, who is up here on the front row. We have a wonderful panel, and we're expecting a rich discussion. If there is time for questions, we will choose from among your suggestions. Thank you again for being here. And now I'd like to turn the podium over to our very distinguished Camilla Benbow, the Patricia and Rhodes Hart Dean of Education and Human Development at Vanderbilt's Peabody College. Dean Benbow, thank you for bringing this incredible team of scholars with us today.
Well, good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to the Vanderbilt Center for Nashville Studies and the Vanderbilt Food for Thought program for organizing today's panel. Thank you. It's amazing, really amazing, to think that 50 years after the Coleman Report, we are still grappling with many of the same issues. This is true in schools all over the country, and of course, also right here in Nashville. We continue to address issues of teacher quality and teacher placement, implicit bias, school choice, how to integrate children whose first language is not English, and the effects of poverty on learning. All of these challenges are topics of research and discussion at Vanderbilt's Peabody College. And we are so proud to be part of the educational community in Nashville and so pleased to participate in this ongoing education policy series. Catherine Gavin Loss will moderate today's panel. Catherine is an assistant professor of the practice of public policy and education at Peabody, where she specializes in the history of American education policy and reform. She also directs our educational doctorate program. And since we don't want to waste any time, I want to turn it over to Catherine right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Benbow, and thanks for having us here today. I've been asked by Jennifer to also mention if you would like to tweet your question. I'm a historian, so I'm not good at social media. However, please tweet that to #VUColeman and mention @VU Peabody. I'm honored to be here with such a distinguished group of colleagues to mark the 50th anniversary of the Coleman Report, to both look back and consider its historical significance as among the most important educational studies of the 20th century, but perhaps more importantly, to look forward and to reflect on its enduring meaning for educational equity and equality of opportunity in our own time. Thanks for coming this morning, and thanks to the FRIST for hosting us. In terms of the flow of today's panel, I will introduce each of our 4 panelists and ask them to offer opening remarks. The panel will collectively engage a set of discussion questions, and then we will open things up to the audience for Q&A. Please submit those discussion questions to Jennifer Johnston on the note cards provided. But first, allow me to begin by situating the Coleman Report in broad historical context. The Coleman Report, or the Equality of Educational Opportunity Study of 1966, it was more formally known, was named for its principal investigator, James S. Coleman, a sociologist at the Johns Hopkins University. Commissioned under Section 402 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Coleman and his team of researchers was tapped by the U.S. Commissioner of Education to examine unequal educational opportunity for individuals by reasons of race, color, religion, and national origin, and to report those findings to the President within 2 years. It was a monumental undertaking, to say the least. Coming in at over 700 pages in length, the study was based on test scores and questionnaire responses gleaned from over 600,000 public school students in elementary grades through high school, as well as survey responses from upwards of 60,000 teachers in 4,000 schools across the United States. Researchers collected wide-ranging information as part of the study, including student achievement data, demographic information, general conditions of school facilities, educational resources, as well as important information on family background, home environment, and a range of other measures. The findings of Coleman and his team were significant and debated widely in academic and policy circles alike, even as some of them proved hardly surprising. A little over a decade removed from the Brown decision and court-ordered desegregation, researchers found first that the majority of children attended segregated schools. They found second that school inputs and general school conditions had little impact on student achievement. Third, that achievement levels of low-income and minority children improved when they attended school with their more advantaged counterparts. Fourth, achievement differences grew as children moved through schools, suggesting that 12th grade gaps in achievement were larger than those when children started school. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly for the Coleman Report, family background proved the most important factor in student outcomes. Schools mattered, yes. Teacher quality mattered, yes. But family background, the Coleman Report found, mattered more. These key findings on peer effects and family background would serve as the basis for the pursuit of integration through court-ordered busing for decades to come. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan would later observe, the Coleman Report proved, quote, the most powerful social science case for school integration that had ever been made. To grasp just how politically controversial the Coleman Report's findings were, however, it's important to note briefly its timing. The timing between its commission in 1964 and the delivery of its results in 1966. As part of his broader war on poverty, President Johnson signed into law the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. The ESEA provided over $1 billion in categorical federal aid to support the education of low-income children. Title I, which constituted the largest provision of the ESEA, earmarked federal funding for poor children in poor districts, even though the funding was distributed more generally. Other key developments in 1965 included the launch of Head Start, which provided funded preschool programs in a range of comprehensive health and social services for low-income families, as well as the Higher Education Act, which provided opportunity grants, forerunner to the modern Pell Grant for low-income students. So that the Coleman's findings just a year after ESEA's enactment, finding that school resources and other inputs mattered far less in equalizing educational opportunity than the social composition of schools and the background of the family, in many ways eroded the basis for Johnson's compensatory education strategy, fueling somewhat of a political backlash against the war on poverty more broadly, and shifted the national policy debate from school inputs to school outputs, which remains so relevant in our own time. As the 1966 school year got underway, just a few months after the Coleman Report's release, the New York Times quoted Coleman himself. Coleman found schools are only successful insofar as they reduce the dependence of a child's opportunities on his social origins. He concluded, equality of opportunity implies not merely equal schools, but equally effective schools whose influences will help to overcome the differences in starting points of children from different backgrounds. So here we are in 2016, fully 50 years after Coleman's findings. A majority of African American and Latino students attend schools segregated by race and poverty. African American students are 4 times as likely to be in high poverty schools as a low poverty school. For white students, the reverse is true. American public schools are more racially segregated now than they were in the 1970s, and economic segregation has risen sharply over the past 2 decades. Housing segregation has likewise led to inequalities of all kinds, and educational attainment is still deeply tied to family background. The questions that consumed Coleman and social policymakers in the 1960s have continued in deep and enduring relevance for educational research, practice, and the law in our own time. So we have assembled a distinguished panel to engage some of these enduring questions, to consider what they mean for the future of educational opportunity. Biographies are provided in today's program. However, let me briefly introduce our distinguished colleagues and ask them to offer some opening remarks. Dr. Rucker Johnson, to my left, is Associate Professor in the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He earned his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, his BA from Morehouse College, and his primary research interests are in labor, health, and urban economics, poverty, and equality. Dr. Claire Smerker is Associate Professor of Public Policy and Education at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College and a consultant with the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice on cases involving school desegregation. She earned her PhD from Stanford University. Her primary interests are in the social context of education and the impact of desegregation plans and choice policies on families, schools, and neighborhoods. Judge Richard H. Dinkins is a justice on the Tennessee Court of Appeals and former cooperating attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Judge Dinkins' legal rulings have addressed the importance of quality teaching and quality of education, and he represented the plaintiffs in Nashville's long-running desegregation case. Judge Dinkins earned his JD from the Vanderbilt University School of Law. Dr. Carol Johnson is a former teacher and principal and has served in school leadership roles across the country, most recently as superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. She is a graduate of Fisk University and earned her doctoral degree from the University of Minnesota. In 2014, she was an advanced leadership fellow at Harvard and is currently a consultant to Memphis City School and Tennessee Department of Education. She's also a visiting professor at Vanderbilt's Peabody College. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. And I'll now ask each of them to sketch out in roughly 5 to 7 minutes the continued relevance of the questions Coleman raised 50 years ago and their implications for contemporary policy, research, and practice.
Great.
Dr. Johnson.
Good. So I'm just delighted to be here, and thank you for joining us. Certainly, Catherine, thank you for the excellent opening remarks and the organizers for this event. I think I want to begin with a quote from John Dewey that I think is fitting for this occasion. Democracy has to be reborn in every generation, and education is its midwife. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Congress mandated that national study on racial disparities in educational opportunity. As Catherine mentioned, 2 years later, James Coleman and colleagues produced the first landmark large-scale national study documenting racial gaps in student achievement. They used cross-sectional survey data, and one of the main methods that they used is to use the proportion of variance in student achievement associated with various inputs, school inputs in particular. That is, they were examining what proportion of the variation or what percent of the variation in student achievement occurs between schools. And they found that schools were found to account for little of the variance in student performance. And one of the conclusions that was reached from that Coleman Report was then that schools had little hope of closing the achievement gap. And actually, that part of the conclusion has been proven to be unfounded. So I want to kind of comment on how the importance of the study, but how our research capacity to examine these issues has evolved in also the changing landscape of study of the student achievement gap. So there are three major limitations of the approach to gauge the potential of school policies as a lever of change and as a guide to policy action by using this kind of decomposition approach. One is certainly just that familial sorting of more advantaged students into certain schools may lead one to confound the family effects with that of the school effects, and therefore may understate or and sometimes overstate the impacts of schools. So it's important to kind of distinguish between those effects. Also, the second limitation is the confounding of efficacy versus prevalence. So it can be the case that there are highly effective policies, but they're not being used broadly and haven't been scaled up in great prevalence across schools across the country. And that would lead to school policies not necessarily accounting for a significant amount of the variance in student achievement, but not necessarily because the efficacy of school policy isn't the most central piece. Okay? The third limitation is that the decomposition methods really don't capture the returns on the investment from pre-K through 12 educational investments that really require longitudinal data that are able to follow children from birth to adulthood with a societal benefit cost framework. So I want to comment that there's some parallels and similarities between the evolution of the nature versus nurture debate and the debate over the potential of schools to narrow the achievement gap versus family background. The long-standing debate about the importance of nature versus nurture, considered as independent influences, is overly simplistic and scientifically obsolete. In the same way in the education fields, we've developed a much deeper appreciation for the inseparable and highly interactive influences of both early life and later childhood conditions, and of both the interaction of family and school effects on the development of the brain, human capital, and the unfolding of behavior, and the dimensionality of skills cultivated in schools, both cognitive capacities as well as non-cognitive skills. And so despite the stubborn persistence of the achievement gap, the overarching question of whether we can intervene successfully in young children's lives to narrow the achievement gap, the answer to that question is actually a resounding yes and should be put to rest. However, it's important to recognize that the interventions that work are rarely simple, inexpensive, or easy to implement. And one of the things that is kind of most exciting about the promise going forward is the explosion of the era of big data, longitudinal data from birth to adulthood, quasi-experimental methods that facilitate causal inference, that although desegregation may seem a remnant of a distant era, it's important to reinterpret the history of desegregation in light of the evidence that has now documented the long-run impacts of school desegregation for African Americans was hugely beneficial, documented significant increases of exposure to integrated schools, leading to significant increases in high school graduation rates, significant increases in college going and college completion rates that were mirrored in significant increases in earnings, that significantly narrowed long-run adult socioeconomic attainment gaps. It's one of the kind of only periods in time where we saw a major convergence in racial differences in adult attainments that even translated into reductions in racial health disparities. Now, these were for cohorts born between 1950 and 1975. The problem is that progress was not able to be continued because we then saw a subsequent resegregation of schools. Now, the effects that I was referencing for African Americans didn't come at the expense of whites. Rather, we saw that the exposure to diversity in grade school significantly impact the long-run outlook on race. That students who attended desegregated schools exhibited greater levels of intergroup friendships, demonstrated lower levels of racial fears and stereotypes. And so I ask on this occasion that we call for a fundamental reexamination of the nation's responses to segregation and achievement gaps, and many of which were, kind of outdated. So let me just give a couple time slots that have to do with the timing for Nashville. So busing for desegregation started here in the fall of 1971, lasted more than a quarter century. Nashville today is far more ethnically diverse than in 1971. But the legal landscape for court-ordered school desegregation was really significantly altered by 3 decisions in the early 90s that really altered the legal basis for desegregation. More than a half of all districts ever under court order were released from court oversight, with more than 200 districts released from court orders since 1991. And in Nashville, that happened in 1998. Federal judge certified the end of Nashville's desegregation case. Now, the issue is that the release of those desegregation court orders led to a significant resegregation of public schools that returned us basically to the levels of segregation from the early 70s. We heard those aforementioned in Catherine's open remarks, so I won't rehash. But the reason this is important is because the mechanism through which school desegregation wrought this significant increase in outcomes in the earlier era was because it led to significant school resource equalization. By that I mean reductions in class size, increases in per pupil spending, increases in teacher quality that had significant long-run impacts on those outcomes. So what happens when concentrated poverty, minority districts occur, it becomes harder to recruit and retain the best quality teachers in those districts. So in the interest of time, to make sure that we really give everyone on the panel, but also you to engage, I just want to implore us to realize this is the great moment to reignite and rebuild the movement toward interconnected and inclusive and inclusionary policies, the moment to fix it, and that diverse integrated schools are part of the answer to help us get there. The current challenges of division and polarization don't have to remain our destiny for our urban areas across the country. But we really have to own where we are and collectively do something about it. As a researcher, I really focus on trying to identify causal effects of education policies, but I'm imploring us today to, instead of thinking about causal effects, cause an effect in our communities to make this difference. People really shouldn't die with memories. People should die with memories, not dreams. But for too many children, not only is the dream not realized, but segregation is stealing the possibility of a dream at a young age. Thank you.
Thank you, Rucker. I'm going to try to use the mic effectively here. Sometimes my family members tell me I'm too loud. I shout in the household. So I'm going to try to, I see a student who's agreeing with that probably. So modulate my voice, okay, and speak more slowly than I sometimes do. So it's great to be here and part of this Nashville community, which is where I situate myself as a faculty member at Vanderbilt University, now in my 25th year. I arrived here with a deep interest and solid training in the areas of social equity, school choice, and desegregation policies. And I've continued to study desegregation, school choice, family school, community relations, and the implications for issues of social justice. I've studied Nashville now for 25 years, in addition to other cities, St. Louis, Cincinnati, East Palo Alto, and others. And notably, as Dr. Loss and Dr. Johnson reported, we are in a position of a position that is captured best by saying desegregation is in question and equality is still elusive. The evidence points to the increasing segregation racially and socioeconomically more profoundly than ever before. So in my teaching, in my research, and in my court testimony in federal desegregation cases, I note the importance of a total ecology of schooling, which is the artifact from the Coleman Report. The total ecology of schooling, meaning context matters. The context of family and neighborhood, as well as schools. And it's our responsibility to better unpack the way in which context matters, the way in which local capacity and local commitment matter in terms of fashioning new and innovative strategies. Now, 2 years ago, we wrote the Nashville Next report. My co-author was Commissioner McQueen, and we outlined some options for cities like Nashville, like Hartford, Connecticut, like the Wake County context, Milwaukee, Detroit, St. Louis, some of the most segregated cities. It's not, of course, about crosstown busing, which was one of the remedies that Justice Kennedy left us with in the Picks decision just 9 years ago. 2007 monumental Supreme Court case that severely limited the options for school districts and communities invested in and interested in desegregation. What do we have left? Very little. Magnet schools, crosstown busing, building new schools in residentially segregated communities. As I often say, that's unrealistic. Magnet schools, we are trying, and look at the figures for magnet schools in any school district that is not under court order. They are increasingly segregated schools, magnet schools. Even in this town, even in our system, despite strong efforts, only a handful of the magnet schools resemble the racial composition of this city. So it's on us. It's on researchers, it's on the faith-based groups, civic organizations, corporations. Look at Louisville. Louisville, Kentucky stands out as a case study where a community has coalesced over 4 decades around a commitment and a capacity to racial and socioeconomic desegregation. Examine Louisville's communities, their housing communities, their residential integration, the way in which, again, all of these actors, all of these stakeholders came together. Parents, educators, again, faith-based groups, civic orgs, and corporate entities. The questions are these. Does diversity still matter? If so, in what form, under what conditions, and for what purpose? And I love your John Dewey. I used John Dewey in my class. Don't use that quote, but I'm going to now steal it from you. What is the public purpose of education? It has always been, and historically, we included this quote in the Nashville Next white paper, so I encourage you to look at that. Public education has served a dual purpose, both public in terms of promoting a workforce that is part of an economic productivity, part of an economic opportunity for all. It's also about forging citizens around an ethic of pluralism, of tolerance, of respect. That kind of education requires, I think, an exposure to all individuals. Students learn what they live, and later they live what they've learned. And I think this needs to be part of the public square, if you will, the public debate, the public discourse. It's incumbent upon researchers like myself to make these kinds of research findings and questions part of a public dialogue. That's why this is so important. That's why I'm so pleased to be part of this FRIST event. But we've slid back. The Coleman Report, which I carried as a graduate student at Stanford University in 1985, carried it under my arm.
All 700 pages, Claire?
That's right, sister. Well, maybe it was the executive summary. You got me. I know the executive summary was carried by congressional staffers throughout the corridors of the U.S. Congress when it came out. I mean, this was monumental. It pushed. It pushed on philanthropy, on the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Danforth Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation. Those foundations stood up and said, we've got to do something. We've got to make families healthier, provide the kinds of supports, whether that is better job training, expanded Head Start, expanded Medicaid. You will note that the Fair Housing Act was passed just 2 years later following the Coleman Report, and it's an amendment to the Civil Rights Act. So we were starting to look at housing and health care and job opportunities. This Coleman Report pushed on that end. The other bookend, desegregation. And as Dr. Loss noted, for 25 years, ramping up desegregation efforts. Through the 1970s, looking at busing and at getting the constitutional approval, the court's approval in the Swan case. Of course, in Charlotte, North Carolina, monumental 1971 case. Busing is approved as a remedy. Later, 5 years later, magnet schools offered and affirmed as a remedy. Then, in the 1990s, the perfect storm, which is what I teach. Where are my students? Yes, perfect storm, very good. Perfect storm, unitary status, and a movement toward unitary status being released from court order, which indeed occurred here in 1998. We were part of hundreds of school districts moving toward unitary status. And at the same time, the Adirondack decision, which applied a strict scrutiny test to all programs involving race and racial desegregation. And that meant you had to find a compelling state interest, and that remedy had to be narrowly tailored. And this test, along with unitary status, proved difficult to pass for many school districts, who then moved off of racial desegregation and into socioeconomic integration. And that's where we sit today, with school districts struggling with this equation, this metric. How do we rezone? How do we encourage choice? Because make no doubt about it, school choice is a highly prized, preferenced value in today's educational policy circles. The Wall Street Journal 3-4 years ago called it the decade of school choice. I think it's the second decade now of school choice. School choice pushed and promoted as a panacea for all educational and social ills, apparently. And I'm talking about charters primarily and school voucher plans. So as school choice pushes against these other aims around desegregation, around integration, it's incumbent upon policymakers, stakeholders, the public at large. And you can think of yourselves as part of a civic community, a faith-based community, a corporate community, a parent community. But it's your time to lean in, to stand up and start talking about this, I think, because these issues need to coalesce around mutual goals. Equity, social equity, fairness, racial integration, and quality and innovation. This is an issue that I often call the geography of opportunity. And we can't make this about a geography of insufficient opportunity. We have to think about expanding opportunities, thinking deeply about options other than crosstown busing, which nobody likes. And by the way, of course, the history of busing was that it was disproportionately borne on the backs of black families. So we need to rethink this. Again, I encourage you to look at the white paper. I'll probably have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some possible approaches to, again, promoting high-quality schools that are innovative and that look like the larger demography and geography of this valuable and wonderful community that is Nashville. Thank you.
When I was asked to participate in this panel with these folks, I said, whoa, you put me in way high cotton. I'm just a lawyer, right? And these are smart people, so you listen to them. And first thing I want to say to both of them is amen to what they said, right? I hope you were taking copious notes for your professor back there. But since I did assume to be the lawyer on the panel, I want to put the Coleman Report, the desegregation effort, in context. And those that know me know whenever I talk, you got to get a history lesson, right? So I want to start back when, in the evolution of public education, began as a recognition that education was only available to those who were wealthy and or through religious institutions. And so it was determined that the public welfare necessitated a system, the welfare of this nation necessitated a system of public education, right? And for many years, particularly in the South, that was segregated by law, by race, okay? And whatever assets that the community chose to invest in its educational program, however it chose to invest those assets, buildings, books, salaries, programs, what have you, were allocated on a segregated basis. In 1955, the U.S. Supreme Court said that violated the Constitution in the Brown case. And so the question then became how to correct that. And unfortunately, it took the Congress, 9 years to come up with the Civil Rights Act that created the Coleman Report. So we lost 9 years right then. And as boards were struggling and resisting desegregation, in Nashville, the Board of Education, let me say, we're the it city now, but we evolved into where we are. We weren't born here. Desegregation was resisted violently in this community. And the board chose the line of least resistance initially. We're going to desegregate a grade a year. So that began roughly in 1956, 57. So by its nature, it took 12 years to be able to assess the effectiveness of that. And guess what? We were still segregated. This was, 4 or 5 years after the Coleman Report, and 2 or 3 years about the time that the legal landscape changed in the Swan case and set up busing as a remedy. And so at that point, we began the first busing plan. And then there was in the middle of all of that, we had a change in the governmental structure, the formation of metropolitan government, which created some more dynamics there, some political dynamics primarily. And Nashville adopted the first busing plan. There, that prompted the phenomenon known as white flight. Whites leaving the system. Some left, actually moved physically their homes out of the system, and some moved their children into private schools. Okay, and so there were demographic changes, and so after 4 or 5 years under that plan, we moved for further relief to address the fact that the desegregation plan actually encouraged white flight because the zone lines were frozen of the busing effort. So people were just moving over into neighborhoods that were not being bused. And it's hard to make a long story short, trust me. But for years, the promoters of Nashville, the Chamber of Commerce, the movers and the shakers said, if we can get out from under the court order, we will be the great city. And so much energy and political pressure was put into that. And it was not about anything other than the stigma, the supposed stigma of being under a court order. And I will tell you, many administrators, many not the political folks, not necessarily the board members, but many teachers and administrators who were interested in kids loved the court order because it provided them an opportunity to teach kids that really needed, the extra stuff, that needed it. There wasn't a lot of resistance to desegregation from the teachers. Parenthetically, I remember one war story. I was working on the case over in Jackson, and we were negotiating with the Madison County Board of Education then, and I ran into the director of their Title I programs, and I said, come here. Let me talk to you. I said, we're settling this case. Tell me what you need. What do you want to do the job that you need to do for these children? And she looked at me and she started crying. And I said, what's wrong? What's wrong? I'm sorry I made you cry. She says, no one ever asked me that. And this is the director of their Title I program, which was another program to set up to assist kids. But in any event, let me say this. When we got to the end of the road here in Nashville, it didn't take Einstein, to figure out that's where the tide was going. And so the board and the plaintiffs spent a number of years coming up with utilizing the best minds not only in this city but in the country to come up with an equitable desegregation plan given the level of resources, the level of demographic reality and population and concentrations of population and what have you. And we got that plan approved. And I will say one thing. There was and I have to put him in this, Gary Orfield, who was a professor who many in the civil rights community took issue with. But I always looked at him as the angel on the left shoulder, whispering, push it a little further, push it a little further. Orfield didn't have a lot of faith in boards to implement what was necessary to equitably educate children who had been historically deprived of opportunities. And he believed, and I believe, and I hope you believe, that just as wealth is inherited, poverty is inherited also. And you have to be educated out of poverty. You can lose money. That's not hard to do at all. But I believe, and the American method, the American way, is you educate yourself out of poverty. And for many years, the equitable desegregation would mandate that kids who had been deprived be educated with those who had not been deprived. So I'm going to leave it there and pass it on to a smarter person.
Thank you very much, Judge Dinkins. It's always such a phenomenal to me to be able to sit with someone who has such institutional memory and can help us sort of revisit what we've done. I do want to thank Dean Bimbo and the fabulous team, Catherine, Claire, and Ellen, who really worked to put this together. And I think the courage to even broach the topic is notable, and so thank you for your leadership in this community. I'm going to actually, my comments, and I appreciate especially having the research community, the legal minds, and then I appreciate the fact that a practitioner, and so my voice is going to be that of someone who works more directly with schools and as a teacher, a principal, and working as a superintendent in Minneapolis, in Memphis, and in Boston. So having dealt with the issues of equity and inequality, and to just say that all three of those districts continue to struggle and are challenged to really close the gap in achievement despite our best efforts. I'm going to try to summarize a few key lessons learned, both a sense of where we've made some progress on some fronts and kind of why this topic, I think, is so relevant at this time. So really a central question is about how the nature of segregation has changed, and to suggest that there's not really one single bullet, that if we just fix families or if we just fix this or that, but that really it's a collective multiplied impact that's really going to produce, I think, the significant change. So I'd like to just frame my comments around sort of three big topics. One having to do with the people, the teachers and the principals who are every day in the schools working directly with our children. A second topic to talk about the systems and the structures that appear to perpetuate some inequality even when we think we've fixed it, right? And then thirdly, to just say we need to focus not just on the what, but the how. How do we really, in our implementation, how do we keep from producing unintended consequences that don't move us in the right direction? So I think we know from the research that the quality of teaching matters a lot, right? But second only to the quality of teaching is the quality of principal leadership. And so what we know from teachers is 97% of teachers say that they will go and work in a school based on who the principal is, and they will stay even in some difficult situations if they trust the principal and they believe that principal is supporting them to do the right things. We also know that from the research that 25% of the achievement of students can be represented by school leadership. So I want to emphasize both two things, the importance of teaching quality and the importance of principal leadership to promote that climate for appropriate instructional strategies to happen. And the example I'll use, I think there are like two big examples that come to mind. One is that when we embarked on really altering the outcomes for children in Boston, we really invested in early childhood education and decided that we were going to go sort of full steam ahead and make sure we gave our students the best early start possible. But what we learned is that it's just not enough to create more seats, right? The seats have to be really quality seats, and the teachers have to be quality teachers. And so we did a lot of investment on the professional development of teachers. We required all of our early childhood teachers to have a master's by their 5th year in teaching with us in an early childhood area, so that we could ensure that not only were they getting the best quality, not only did we have a second paraprofessional in the room, but that we really were going to make sure that we had quality curriculum and that we were going to really focus in on improving the quality. It was not cheap. We were probably spending $12,000 a student per year to make sure that we ratcheted up both the quality of learning that they experienced and making sure that the teachers, and I think as a result of that, we really partnered with the NAEYC, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and we also, and you can hear this theme over and over again, because I really truly believe that unless you partner effectively, and it took me a long time to learn this, but with a research institution who helps you to monitor and look at your practices and then help you with a third-party eye, look to see whether you've made a difference. You may be continuing to look at yourself and not be honest about whether what the strategies you're using are really working. So this notion, though, of building the teacher pool, and of course, there's increasingly in some states, Oklahoma, Nevada, big shortages of teachers. I know at the University of Michigan, they said their enrollment in teacher education programs is 35% lower than it has been in the past. Teach for America has fewer people enrolling in teaching. And so we have to focus both on the quality of teaching, we have to focus on getting, and there is also a decline in the number of Black and Latino teachers across the country. So we have to really focus on this notion of how we're going to put the best teachers and then make sure we train the best principals to lead this quality instructional process that is going on. And I just say this, that I heard last week that the average teacher's classroom has a range of almost 11 grade levels in terms of what students know. So even as we ask them to teach well, we have to remember that they have the kids who arrived on time, had preschool, parents read to them, and they have the kids who just arrived yesterday, they're non-English speaking, they haven't had those early learning experiences, and we're asking teachers to do some extraordinary work with a range that's much broader than maybe possible without these added supports, without strong leadership. So the importance of leadership, and I'll just say I think the importance of leadership extends beyond the classroom and extends beyond the school. The people at the central office have to see their work as geared to focusing on the work that happens every day in school and see that the bottom line is no matter what happens at central office, no matter what the superintendent says, it's really whether or not we're supporting the things that matter for teachers and principals and school people and families. I think that in addition to sort of the skill sets with teachers, we have to make sure that teachers develop the sort of Carol Dweck mindset, that they actually believe that all children can achieve, and they have to really every day see themselves. I used to have a slogan in Memphis that said, every child, every day, college bound, and of course people would say to me, everybody shouldn't go to college. Okay? So my answer to that is, that's a choice every family should make. But I want every teacher to teach every day as if they thought that every kid in their classroom might go to college. So the mindset is not on the part of what choices parents make, the mindset is on the part of what teachers believe about the kids who sit in front of them. Systems and structures. So there are a myriad of systems that persistently reproduce inequality. And in the old days we called it tracking, but there are new and different and bolder ways to track. And so if you look at any system, what you will see are systems to really funnel certain kids one way, sort other kids another way. And so this notion of creating an integrated environment, giving school choice, only works to the extent that people are attentive to how and who gets served, how money gets distributed. So the example I'll use is when I first went to Boston, I noticed that our most affluent schools all taught Algebra 1 at the 8th grade. And our poorest schools didn't offer Algebra 1 at all at the 8th grade. So when I would ask the teachers, like, why aren't you offering algebra? Or the principal, well, our kids really can't do that. Well, you know what? We are going to create the conditions, the scaffolding that is necessary for those kids prior to them getting to 8th grade so that there will be more kids moving into, because here's the gatekeeper. If you don't take Algebra 1 at the 8th grade, you can't take geometry at 9th, you can't Algebra 2 at 10th, you can't take trig at 11th, and you can't take pre-cal. And you know what? The difference in your getting into best schools, getting ready for real college, right, is proportionate to your access to rigorous academic curriculum. And so, again, these tracking, sorting things, and it's about who gets into AP. Are there entrance requirements? Which schools we had schools that had no arts classes, and then we had schools who had lots of orchestra and band and everything. And so, again, the leadership has to be attentive to the systems and structures that have been put in place to sort kids. I think Jason Grissom and Christopher Redding, right here at Vanderbilt, did a study that said black third graders are half as likely as white third graders to be included in gifted and talented programs. So the distribution issues of who gets access to what. And I don't want people to think that I'm saying, okay, just put everybody in Algebra 1, it'll be fine. No. What I'm saying is we have to scaffold, we have to build the bridges where kids are ready to perform at these high levels. It's not just to just create a door and then allow kids to fail, but it's to scaffold them along the way so that we can see. And again, I just want to emphasize the importance of having research partners to actually help us. And we did have research partners with our special ed efforts to try to create more inclusive environments, with our English language learners trying to create more inclusive environments, with Boston U, with our Dropout, with Northeastern University. So I think these research partners help to open a window, as Vanderbilt is doing, so that we can see firsthand whether we really are expanding opportunities for all children. So the structures and systems. Now, I just want to mention some of the structures and systems we don't have control over. So Dick Murnane and Greg Duncan, researchers, pointed out that in 1970, poor families were spending about $800 a year on discretionary income on helping their kids get a good education. At that same time, the more affluent families were spending about $3,500. So poor families didn't have much discretionary income. Affluent families had more. And now, I think in 2010, they concluded that the more affluent families were spending about, I think, $9,000. And our poorest families were spending about $1,300. So some inequality exists because of income disparities. So we have to do our share to sort of make that up. So I talked a little bit about the people, teaching quality, a little bit about the structures and systems that perpetuate inequality. And then thirdly, not so much the what, but the how. So what we've learned over the last 5 decades is that despite our best intentions, there are unintended consequences as we are trying to complete. So we have to be really, truly attentive. So, I mean, one thing about this 5 to 7 minutes, it doesn't really give you time to just say everything you think. So, and I have a lot of thoughts about this topic. So we created a Choice is Yours program when I was in Minneapolis, and it was supposed to be St. Paul was busing kids from the suburbs and back and forth, and Minneapolis, so all voluntary. And it's gone pretty well, but it's a small program, about 2,000 kids participate. And I would say that increasingly it's been more difficult. Minneapolis is a city that has, in the 80s we had a lot of Southeast Asian, Hmong, Vietnamese, and then later on we had a lot of East Africans, Somalian. And so as the demographics of a city alters and changes, the ability to really figure out what it means to create an integrated environment shifts. And that's certainly true in other cities where the Latino population is growing. In Boston, which has a much more international population, we see. So whenever you create, so everybody loves the idea of choice, right? We all love choice. And so not the what, but the how, right? So because what we see increasingly in Minneapolis is this, and I'll use Minneapolis as an example because they have a new a legal case. So they have 131 total charter schools. 48 of them are in the suburbs. 32 of the 48 in the suburbs are all white. And they're located next door to schools that have a higher minority percentage population in the suburban district. And so choice is something that we all want to value and give parents choice. But we have to be careful because there are unintended consequences, and it's not the what, but the how things get implemented that can either foster the kind of world we want to live in. And just let me end by saying, somewhere down the road, I think we stopped caring if all the poor kids learned. We stopped caring if all the poor kids were segregated in one school or if all the black kids were in one school. Somewhere down the line, we weren't sure if it mattered if all the kids went to post-secondary. And if just some went, maybe it was okay. And so I think somewhere down the line, we thought that we were only competing locally and internally, that if we were just a little bit better than Mississippi, we were okay. In Memphis, we used to say, thank God for Mississippi, we'd be dead last in everything. Okay? So I guess my point here is this. We're not competing with Mississippi and Tennessee. That's not where the competition is. And we have to get better at educating a more diverse population so that we can compete internationally. And a couple weeks ago, I was in Kentucky, and the Pritchard Committee was meeting, and one of the educators from Kentucky said this: proficiency is a low bar. If we are serious about competing internationally, we have to educate our children beyond just being proficient. I think that is the challenge before us, and ultimately, every child deserves really the best possible education we can give them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thanks to all our panelists. I'd like to, at this point, pick up on a few themes that emerged from all four of our panelists' introductory comments, and that is tacking back to the Coleman Report's findings on family background on the one hand and school effects on the other. What we've learned since the Coleman Report, of course, is a lot of things about the interconnectedness, of course, between family background, school, housing, neighborhoods, as they relate to quality of educational opportunity, and of course, as they relate to life chances. So I'd like to ask the panelists in the order in which they would like to take up this question to think about their own work and how they might answer that question. So, Dr. Johnson or Dr. Smirker, I'll start with you.
So I guess what I would offer is that one of the things that we've learned is that we've typically produced solutions that are very fragmented in nature. So we have housing policy operating on a silo that's kind of doing one set of things. We have like maybe the pre-K community operating over here, but not necessarily in close collaboration with the K through 12 community, as Dr. Johnson described in the way that she fostered it. But more generally, the typical approach is much kind of fragmented, isolated, separate, independent interventions. But the reality of kind of child development is that these are always interconnected, that educational and health interventions have multiplier, what I call child multiplier developmental effects, that in concert, they produce effects where the total effect of the combined effect of, say, early child education quality and high quality K through 12 schools lead to a sum that's much larger than the sum of the individual parts. So what's important to think about the interconnectedness of early life education and health investments is that when they're coordinated and strategically implemented, they do have the power to both break the cycle of poverty and raise the kind of ways in which schools can play a central role in leveling the intergenerational playing field. But if we continue to seek solutions that are magic bullets, if we think charter schools are just magically going to kind of cause innovation to fall out of the sky without subsequently evaluating which charter schools are doing what to extract the lessons from innovation, then we're just going to be trying a bunch of things that look new but aren't better. So it's really the coordination and the synergistic effects of education and health policy, but also recognizing that without housing policy, there will be limited impact of schools actually becoming integrated. So we do have to foster more mixed income neighborhoods, and that requires recognizing that school districts and school leaders cannot really play the only player in fostering this integration that we so desperately yearn, or at least I so desperately yearn, and hope that more of you will so desperately yearn. So thank you.
Thank
Thank you. The Brookings Institution is doing some really interesting work along civic mobilization and creating civic engagement across the silos that Dr. Rucker Johnson just described. So I encourage you to look at the book Metropolitan Revolution, which describes this integration across the housing sector, health sectors, education sectors. It's about leadership. And I love Dr. Carol Johnson's note about the importance of school-based leadership, but this is about municipal and regional leadership and thinking more regionally about these problems as well. And that requires universities participating alongside the large and small employers, again, the other kinds of sub-communities that I described. We have learned some lessons from the 2 decades of community schools and school-linked social services, which was an attempt to bring health and social services into the school. Because again, school is the social institution. It's the social fabric, stitching together families and communities at a single site. But we learned some important lessons. It was not the magic bullet or the panacea. Community schools or school-linked social services, where services are right there at the school, suffered, broke, and became quite brittle under the weight of a lack of trust and communication. You can't, again, magically put together a group of people, put them at the school site, and if we build it, they will come. No, they won't. Because parents have been disenfranchised, because they don't trust schools, because their experience in schools was very negative and disheartening. So you have to reach out and reach into communities and build that trust. And often it is the superintendent and his or her cabinet and the school leadership and working with parents and making it as though it were a public health campaign, going door to door, enlisting parents, creating that trust and sustaining that dialogue. And that takes a lot of effort and a lot of commitment. And again, you have to recognize capacity issues and the need to scale that up. So my own work on school-linked social services, I have an article entitled The Missing Link in School-Linked Social Services, and that was the fact that we never brought teachers in to this equation, so they sort of pushed it aside, oh, that's somebody else's work. I think they're in that trailer out in the parking lot. I think you need to go out there. Literally, I interviewed across schools in Tennessee and in Kentucky, and teacher after teacher said, oh, I don't really know anything about that. I think that's something that a social worker handles. So you've got to stitch it together. Everybody has to be inside that cultural coherence and that cultural commitment to stitching together the needs and support systems for families.
May I say a couple things? One, another war story. When we were negotiating with the board on the DSEG plan, I talked to the head of the teachers union, and I asked him to participate, and he wouldn't, and I didn't understand why, and I asked him again. He said, no, I'm not going to participate. I said, why not? He said, because the board does not honor its agreements. And I said, no, this one's going to court. They will honor this one. And lo and behold, I don't say the board didn't honor the agreement. I'll just say it was not fulfilled, okay? The players changed, and I hold the new board responsible for what happened. Okay. The other thing I want to say is we mentioned charters, and I have to confess, after much opposition to charters, and after prayerful consideration, and I did. Okay. I've served on the board of a charter school for a number of years, and many times I'm in there and I'm saying, thank God I am here, because the potential for positive is there, but there's an equal potential for negative there, and equal, if not greater potential for negative. And when you talked about the charters in Minneapolis being all white right next to, suburban Minneapolis. Nashville has never truly defined the role of charters in Nashville. And I think that's something that needs to happen. It needs to happen. Politically, with the ASD and what happened with the Great Hearts and that appeal and the political, the mayor at the time not backing the board's refusal to issue that, that's the type of stuff that we need to, like she said, have a coordinated community effort, right, in how we are going to educate our children. Charters have a role in that. Private schools have a role in that. Parochial schools have a role in that. The universities have a role in that. The Chamber of Commerce has a role in that. Community organizations, churches have. It is a community effort, folks. And the lawsuit can't do it. The research by itself can't do it. We all have to do it.
So I do want to just respond. So I hope my comments didn't suggest that I am anti-charter. I think that truth in advertising, my husband taught history in a charter school in Memphis. So I just want to be clear. I think what I was saying is this. It's not the what, it's the how. And what I was trying to emphasize is that how people innovate, how people are inclusive and not inclusive, whether in traditional schools or regular schools, matters. I'm just going to go back a little bit to the sort of question about neighborhood and families, because I think that whether you're, well, so first of all, I believe that whether you send your kid to Hume Fogg or Martin Luther King or Pearl Cone, or whether you send your kid to whatever school you send them to, White Station High in Memphis, it's apparent you have to be involved in your child's education. Whether you choose a private school, a public school, a charter school. I will never second guess a parent's decision about where to send their kid. It's the most personal decision. I want them to be an active chooser, right? Actively engaged in researching what works best for your child. And many parents will decide different things for different children in the same family. But I guess what I want to also say is that it's really important for us to evaluate. It's important for Vanderbilt to examine what's happening with the Achievement School District. It's important for the research community to have a voice, to be a third-party partner in monitoring so that we can learn. I mean, ultimately, we're experimenting with our children, and so we have to learn what works and what doesn't. It isn't fair to them for us to just try things without making sure that we are collecting the data in a very partnership way so that we know what works. There are fabulous partners, charter schools in Memphis, in Boston, in Minneapolis, in every city I've been in. I think that the worrisome factor around desegregation is that increasingly in the suburbs of Minneapolis, we see schools that are developing in very racially specific ways. And I would even say in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're seeing schools at the Hmong Academy, the German Immersion Program, the classical. They're appealing to or the African American Studies School. I mean, we're appealing to a very specific and intentional group. And I just think that we have to ask ourselves long term how important it is for our children to have a broad understanding of the diversity in this community. And our children to grow up honoring the diversity and seeing it as value and not just, I think one of the problems we have really with some of the things that have happened, with the police department or whatever is people haven't had enough experiences to feel safe and trusting. And so we have to do it with parents, not to parents.
I have a few more questions as moderator, but I want to make sure that we have time to for the audience to have some questions. And one of them came through that I think I'll ask to the panel. Much of our discussion this morning has focused on school integration in terms of students and desegregation in terms of pupils. So this question is about desegregation of the faculty and of teaching. So the question from the audience is, are teachers as segregated as students? If so, what can we do about this? So I'll just open that up to the panel to engage it, whoever wants to take it first.
One of the things that we did in the desegregation plan, we looked at the declining number of black teachers, and that is a challenge. That is a challenge. Not so much that only black teachers can teach black kids or black kids only relate to black kids, but people, the environment needs to be diverse, and all children need to see black adults and white adults in positions of authority, in positions of leadership, calling some shots, you know. So, you know, when I talk about the plan, and so, the board was not the only entity that had responsibility that dropped the ball in that, and it was it was truly a disappointment to me personally that a teacher training program that we had grafted into the plan for the Pearl Cone cluster, the ball was dropped on that, because we were sort of looking at using the program at TSU, which used to produce all the black teachers in the state. I mean, this is not a new thing for them. But they dropped the ball over there. And we're trying to get it back going now. But that's a generation that's lost. And I don't know what it's going to take.
So under the court order in Boston, Judge Garrity ordered that the school district had to hire 25% black teachers and 10% other. So other meant Asian or Latino. During my tenure, we had a very difficult time. We pretty much stayed in the early 20s, 22, 23. We never were at 25. I talked to somebody this week in Boston, and they're like at 18 or 19%. So even though the court order really required a percentage, keep in mind, I think that Judge Garrity set the order in part because the student population, at least today in Boston, and I'm not sure in 1974, but the student population in Boston is about 42% Latino, about 35% black, about 13% white, and about 8% Asian, and then there is about 1% multiracial. So actually, the school district is about 87% students of color, but the teacher ranks were 65% white, 35% teachers of color. And the only other thing I would say is that I think an additional concern I have around the teaching workforce. The teaching workforce, K-12, has been about over 80% women over a few decades here, and it's been increasing. I think it's like at 82%. So I am troubled a little bit about the men and getting more men in education so that our children are exposed to a broad gender diversity. And I would say that for African American men, it's a significant problem. So I do think that we have work to do in this regard.
I think it's ironic that only districts under court order are court ordered to look at the diversity of their faculty. So it's one of the so-called green factors as a result of the Green v. New Kent, Virginia case in 1968. Emerged as one of 5 factors that a district must be within compliance. So it's just ironic that only if you're under court order, under that kind of scrutiny, do you have to adhere to this. So some districts have been very innovative. They've now using social media. They are going to the places where the schools of education are turning out students of high quality, either white students or black students, new teachers, and recruiting those teachers. I think it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of new strategies. I think one untapped source that we've been talking about in one of the DSEG cases that I'm a part of, and I think this is part of the public record so I can discuss it, and that's the troops to teachers. And 20 years of military or fewer years of a military service, highly educated, eager to start or launch a second career. And so Troops to Teachers has long been a good program, and it also provides the gender mix that we're looking for. So, and many of those troops, members of the military, are individuals of color, black and Latino. So it's a really nice feeder.
I'll just add briefly just that the research does show that as the release of court orders led to resegregation of schools, the increased concentration of poverty that resulted also led that as student composition of schools becomes more heavily minority and poor, that the general pattern across schools across the country is that the most qualified teachers tend to transfer to other schools on average. So this is why it's not necessarily a peer effect story. It has to do with how school resources get distributed differently depending on the composition, the socioeconomic and racial composition of the school.
So there's another audience question that actually feeds very nicely into a question that I had already developed. So that works well, and I will pose it to the group now. We've talked a lot about the history of desegregation, how it evolved over time, and as it played out, often the one-way nature of school desegregation, often borne out on the backs of African American families. So the question is, one, to what extent is school integration across race and socioeconomic lines even a policy priority in our own time? So to what extent is it a policy priority? And secondly, as you think about school desegregation efforts today, what are some of the central factors to consider for good policy implementation and practice? To the audience question, how do we get parents to engage in this question and to think about the importance of integrated schools and the benefits of integration, not just for African American children, but for all children? So, to the group.
Well, let me say that being the lawyer and the judge, I'm going to take a little privilege here. Someone said earlier, a good question is, does diversity still matter? And that's one of those civic gut checks we have to make. Does it matter? Does it matter from a civic perspective? But more importantly, I think we need to, ask, does education matter? Because my dad taught me that one of the ways you know a person's priority is you look at their appointment book and their checkbook, right? And the resources that we put is a pretty good indication of what we value. We have to value, as a community, we have to value education to the point where we knock that into our kids every day. We preach it to them, and we teach it, but we also show them by where we put our resources. We see all of these beautiful new buildings going up around here. We see all of this, and we have to tell and teach our children to value education, respect the teachers. We need to train the teachers and so that they respect and interact with the children. And we can't get into the blame game. We got to get into the solution game, right? And to that extent, when I said, charters have a role and private schools have a role, they do that. They do that well. And the community as a whole needs to adapt those sort of practices that they are using and apply them outside of those environments.
Yeah, so let me just build on the judge's comments just about remembering this, that the U.S. Supreme Court struck down racial integration plans in Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle in 2007 for violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And following that ruling, school choice policies could no longer take race into account. And so many districts are now implementing socioeconomic-based school assignment plans. I think it's noteworthy that in a recent interview, Arne Duncan, when asked to cite his failures as Secretary of Education, he included the absence of progress on school integration. And at the same time, there's been these recent developments in a positive direction in this regard over the past year that, for example, President Obama's budget includes a new $120 million grant to support school integration, which is more than double the federal funding of efforts to encourage school integration. Their program is called Stronger Together, and this grant program is to support local efforts to integrate schools by income. The proposed plan would set up competition to reward districts or groups of districts that voluntarily take efforts to break up school poverty concentrations. And what that's resulted in the number of school districts that take socioeconomic status into account as a factor in school assignment has doubled since 2007. So there is a wave momentum to kind of put this back on the agenda after it's been kind of in hiding, I would say, from the public agenda. But I think the more general part about what's the role of diversity, I do think that our workplaces are increasingly requiring the kind of competencies that you can work well in teams with backgrounds different than your own. And if we're exposing children to diversity only as adults, I think we're kind of very much not fulfilling, that role of giving them that type of experiential learning in diverse settings in their school-age years. Thank you.
I don't think I hate to be negative Nelly here, but I don't think that there is enough discussion about the positive, what we know to be so true over decades of research, the positive social and academic consequences of diversity, the benefits, the social and academic benefits of integrated school settings, and that those school settings then set the platform for interest in and engagement around diversity in the neighborhood, in a workplace, in other social settings and social structures. So schools provide the imprint, the blueprint for moving forward in engaging in desegregation. We can't be different all by ourselves. We can't balkanize. I think this is, particularly at this moment, as we sit within less than 2 weeks from the election, this year has been monumental in demonstrating the cost of intolerance, the cost of balkanization, the cost of social isolation, the cost of intolerance and not listening and not being able to engage in some civil discourse. And that begins in schooling when children are young. And the neighborhood piece is huge too. And if we don't get our arms around that and start thinking about how to promote integrated neighborhoods, residential settings, we're in deep trouble.
Let me just add real quick that Charlotte, that's not by coincidence. They are among the most segregated schools, and they actually have the lowest upward mobility rates for low-income children because of that segregation. So when these kind of high-profile incidents that demonstrate the lack of deficits of community trust, they do emanate from something that is coincidentally very related to this conversation.
So I've been to lots of community meetings where we ask parents what they want. And I think that what I hear over and over again, they don't start with diversity, right? They start with, we want our children to go to a quality school. And their definition of quality is not based on a test score. It's not based on TCAP. They got all these other things that they care about. And they range from, the school climate is welcoming to they have good after-school programs. There's childcare in the morning when I have to get to work. The principal is great. So they have these sort of quality indicators. Performance is one, so I don't want to say that they don't pay attention to test scores and so forth, but it's not the only driver for them. I think that, importantly, when you talk to more African American parents, They want their children to have a diverse experience because they know that to navigate America, you have to be able to work with different kinds of people, because in the real world, that's what you're going to have to do. And so I'm not sure that that value extends to everybody, diversity. And I mention that because in the new student assignment policy that we worked on in Boston, where there was lots of pressure for neighborhood schools, and we created a whole algorithm with MIT researchers to both honor simultaneously choice, give people quality, and try to get them close to home, which is a complicated algorithm. But needless to say, this quality piece and the parents' definition of quality has to be paid attention to.
So the 90 minutes has come and gone so quickly. I'd like to conclude by thanking the audience for coming out this morning, and to ask them to join me in thanking our distinguished panel of experts in thinking about these really important and enduring questions around educational equity and educational opportunity. So thank you.